Hi again. All right, I'm going to give you a short video about the Donnellan paper that you've been assigned. Now, just to give you a bit of sort of dialectical background, at the time Donnellan's writing, there's sort of an established debate between Russelly people and Strawson-y people about whether definite descriptions presuppose that there is some unique object they refer to, or whether they uh, entail that there is such an object without presupposing it. Okay, so that's going to make a difference to whether a sentence containing a definite description comes out false on the Russelly view, or uh, lacking a truth value on the Strawson-y view when there is no such person. So a sentence like "the current king of France is wise," this sentence, that's one of Strawson's examples, that sentence is going to be false according to Russell, because according to Russell, that says there is a person who is the current king of France, who is currently king of France, and nobody else is currently king of France, and that person is wise. Well, there is no such person, so that thing I just said is false. Strawson thinks, though, that while this sentence entails that there is a person who is king of France, it merely presupposes it. So, because it entails that there's such a person, that means if this sentence, the king of France is wise, if this sentence is true, then it has to be true that there is a king of France. But if this sentence is false, if it's false that the king of France is wise, then there still has to be a king of France. If there's no king of France, then the sentence is neither true nor false. Okay, and we saw that that's what Frege thinks too. Okay, Donnellan is now going to intervene in this debate and make a move kind of like the ones that I talked about Strawson making in his paper. So remember, Strawson says there's a distinction that Russell doesn't notice, right? We need to be careful about the difference between a sentence, a use of a sentence, and an utterance of a sentence. And once we notice that distinction, we'll see that meaning applies to one of these levels, whereas reference or truth value applies to another one, and that's supposed to tell you something. Okay, Donnellan's going to say here, we can draw a couple of distinctions. They sound similar, but they are different. I've put them here as distinction 1 and distinction 2. I'll talk about both. And once you notice these differences, the debate between Russell and Strawson kind of looks weird and dumb. I'm putting words in his mouth. Donnellan in this paper is carefully neutral about who's right about whether the King of France is wise entails or presupposes, whether it presupposes or doesn't that there is a King of France. But he does make comments on both people and sort of say, yeah, you're both kind of missing something. As I read this paper, I'm always surprised when I read this. He seems to be more harsh on Russell than on Strawson, where I tend to think of the things Donnellan's saying as being more friendly to a Strawsonian kind of view. I think who whom Donnellan's harder on is more a reflection of like who was dominant in who was sort of winning the fight, who was winning the hearts and minds of philosophers at the time. So anyway, what are the two distinctions? Let's start with actually what I'm calling distinction 2 here. No, let's start with distinction 1. I numbered it number 1 for a reason. Okay, distinction 1 between referring and denoting. These are Donnellan's terms. This is a distinction between two kinds of relations that a use of a definite description can have to an object. Okay. The easy one is denoting. So let me underline the definite description here, the King of France. Actually, let me change this to something that does denote someone. Is it like disrespectful if I don't capitalize queen? Whatever. I guess queen can be a name, but it's also a whatever. Okay. Here's a sentence I might say, and here is a definite description that's part of that sentence, right? The Queen of England. Now, this is a description because it picks out that person not by giving her name. I'm not saying Elizabeth II is wise. I'm saying somebody who has this property. She's the Queen of England at the moment. Somebody else could have had that property. There was a time when that same person didn't have that property of being Queen of England, right? When she was very young, she was not yet queen. What I'm doing here is picking her out by means of some description. So, here's what denoting means. A person is denoted by a description just in case they actually have the properties in the description. So as long as she is Queen of England, this description denotes her. Likewise, there are several descriptions that would denote me, the convener of Mind and Language for this year. That picks out me because I happen to be the convener. The middle child of my parents. Am I giving you enough information to steal my identity? I don't think so. The middle child of my parents. That picks out me. Don't tell anyone. Okay, so being denoted by a definite description just means that you actually have the properties in the description, that it actually does, that you, as we sometimes put it, satisfy that description. Okay, what's referring, on the other hand? Referring has to do with what the speaker's trying to do with the description. Okay, I'm actually going to come back to this in a minute. Let's just bear in mind, denoting means actually satisfying the properties in the description. So something we can say about the previous description we had here, the King of France, we can say this doesn't denote anyone. There is nobody who satisfies these properties. There's nobody who has these properties. Nobody who satisfies this description. Nobody who has these properties. Okay. I'm going to say, after we leave and come back, I'm going to say it's nevertheless possible, even though that description doesn't denote anyone, it's still possible for a speaker to refer to somebody with it. So, referring is something like Strawson's mentioning. So if I want to talk about somebody, I can do so by means of a description that doesn't denote them. We'll get examples in a second, but first let's talk about two different uses of a definite description. So I said a speaker can use a description like this to refer to somebody even though it doesn't denote anyone. So we're talking now about uses, thinking in Strawson's terms. Remember the distinction between a sentence, a use of a sentence, an utterance of a sentence. We're going to talk about certain kinds of use of a description. And Donnellan goes along with Strawson in thinking that reference and also denotation, so whether and what a definite description refers to or denotes depends on the use, not just the words themselves. Okay. Let's talk about these two different uses Donnellan says there are of a definite description. One he calls referential and one he calls attributive. Okay, let me give you an example of a case where I might use this very description to refer to something, and this is going to be an example of a referential use. Okay, which makes sense because it's a case where I'm going to be referring to somebody. So imagine, like a typical North American, I don't know that much about European politics, and I see that French political leader on the TV saying things about handling a current political crisis or something like that. I see Macron. He's still in charge, right? and I say, oh man, the way that guy is handling the current crisis shows that he's very wise. That's what I think to myself. I think, that guy, Macron, he's very wise. But what I say out loud to you, because we're watching TV together, what I say out loud to you is, the King of France is wise. Again, I'm a little oblivious. I know he's in charge of France, and I think he's the king, because, like, Europe has monarchies, right? That's why they had revolutions in the other places, because they didn't want to have monarchies. England has a queen, so whoever's in charge of France, that must be the king. I say, the King of France is wise. Okay. According to the stories we've gotten from Russell and Strawson, the thing I just said can't be true. According to Russell, I've said that there is one and only one person who's King of France, and that person is wise. That's false, because there's no such person. According to Strawson, it seems like I've tried to refer to somebody who isn't there, right? I've just presupposed that there's one and only one person who rules France as a monarch and is male, and there's no such person, so I haven't managed to say anything true or false. But according to Donnellan, the thing I just said could be true. So suppose that Macron is actually handling things well, and it's because he's wise. I might be right here. I've made a mistake, right? My assertion isn't perfect, because Macron isn't actually King of France. But the thing that I've said here is that he's wise. So Donnellan's story is to say, I can use this definite description to refer to the person on the TV. And as long as the thing I say about that person is true, then I've said something true. Okay. So here's a case where I have used a definite description, the King of France, to refer to Macron, even though that definite description doesn't denote Macron, because he doesn't have the property of being King of France. I am actually a kind of typical North American. What is he? President? Prime Minister? Chairman? Whatever. He's not the king. That's the important point here. But as long as I manage to talk about him, and like maybe if I point at him, then you'll pick up what I'm saying. Maybe from context, you, who I'm in a conversation with, will understand what I mean. You might feel like correcting me and tell me he's not the king. But you can also just accept what I say. Okay. So Donnellan thinks, and he gives you other examples in the paper. I'll let you read those. But Donnellan thinks I might sometimes successfully use a definite description to refer to somebody it doesn't denote. That might be a situation where it doesn't denote anybody, like in this case. It might also be a situation where it denotes someone else. So imagine if instead of being confused about France, I'm confused about England. Right, and I think let's move back a little bit to when we had a woman prime minister. I might use a description like the Queen of England to talk about Theresa May. I might say, the Queen of England is not handling Brexit very well. I might, according to Donnellan, manage to say something true about Theresa May by means of that description, even though it denotes somebody else. There is a person who satisfies the description, the Queen of England. It's Elizabeth II. But I might still refer to a different person, Theresa May, when I say the Queen of England is handling Brexit poorly. Okay. Now, those are some cases where we have a referential use of a definite description. So the person that we refer to need not be the person that we denote. But if we look down at distinction 2, we see there's another kind of use. So Donnellan thinks sometimes so with some uses of a definite description, you might refer to somebody not denoted by the definite description. But there are other uses where if you refer to anybody, it's going to be the person that you denote. So suppose instead of watching this specific person, Macron, on the TV, I'm thinking about monarchs in general. Let's change the sentence. Instead of saying he's wise, imagine I'm like a big, what do you call it, revolutionary, anti-monarchist. I just think all of the monarchs of Europe should be overthrown. Okay. So I say, look, there are no exceptions. The Queen of England needs to be deposed. The King of France needs to be chopped down. The King of the Netherlands, the Queen of Germany, all of them need it. Okay. In this case, the thing I care about is whether the person's monarch, the monarch of that country. Okay, I'm trying to talk about the person that I think satisfies this description, the person that I think is denoted by the description, the King of France, if I'm this big anti-monarchist, right? The King of Ireland has got to go. In this sentence, then, if there is no person who satisfies that description, then there's no person that I'm talking about. I'm saying, I'm trying to talk about the person who satisfies this description. In other words, the person who has those attributes. So think of King of France as being a certain property, right? Like being the middle child of my parents. That's a property I have. That's an attribute of me. When I use this description here, I'm attributing those properties to that person, and that's the part that I care about. Okay. If you say to me, Macron isn't the king, there is no king of France, then I'm going to want to take this back. I'm going to say, oh, well, then there's nobody. There's nobody who needs the chop. Unlike in the TV case, when I was saying the King of France is wise, he's handling this very well. If you say to me, Macron isn't the king, they don't have a king, he's the president, then I'll say, oh, right, well, you know what I meant, though. The president of France is wise. I won't say, I take it back. Okay, so here's the picture we've got then. If we're thinking about the general question of whether sentences with empty descriptions, empty definite descriptions, that is, definite descriptions that don't denote anybody, and we're wondering, are those sentences or are uses of those sentences false or truth valueless? Donnellan's going to say, first of all, we have to be careful about which kind of use we're talking about. If we're talking about referential uses, there's another option. They might actually be true. If we're talking about attributive uses, he's going to say, we need to be careful. Some sentences, it'll be yes, and some sentences, it'll be no. Or sorry, some uses yes, some uses no. But this makes the whole debate a bit more complicated. Okay, I'm going to leave you to read the paper yourself and see how Donnellan uses these distinctions, a little bit more about exactly how he gives them. You might want to ask, how do I know when I have an attributive versus a referential use? He's not going to give you a definite answer to that. He's going to say, here are some things that you might think are answers that would give you a theory of that would predict when you have an attributive versus a referential use. None of them quite work. That's something for you to think about on your own if you like. But as long as you can recognize differences, at least clear differences between those kinds of uses, then you're okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm starting to ramble here. What I'm trying to say is I want you to read the paper to see how these distinctions are useful in intervening in the debate between Russell and Strawson about sentences about the King of France. But I want you to be, first of all, clear on each distinction and that they're different. They're related, but they're different. So the exam question about Donnellan asks you about one of these distinctions. I need to make sure that you clearly see a difference between the two. So this is about two different relations that a definite description might have to a person or object. This is two different, as it says right there, uses of a definite description. Okay, I'm going to leave off there. If you have any questions about any of this, you know what to do.